I devoted the best years of my life to saving my family's business, only to be blindsided by the most gut-wrenching betrayal. Watching that business implode now feels like the ultimate payback. My story starts with a choice I made years ago, a choice that cost me a promising tech career. At 24, I was just stepping into a bright future when tragedy struck. My father was in a devastating accident that left him with brain damage and 2 years of paralysis. The weight of the family business fell on me, and my brother, Kyle, was never one for responsibility. The moment things got tough, he checked out, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I couldn't walk away. I knew how much this company meant to my father. My great-grandfather started it, and my grandfather and father poured everything they had into growing it. I'd be damned if I let it fall apart on my watch. So, I quit my tech job, a position I had worked so hard to secure, and threw myself into saving the company. I don't regret that decision, at least not entirely. I worked tirelessly for years, bringing the business to a level of stability and profit that hadn't been seen in decades. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was solid. Then, just when I thought my sacrifices were starting to pay off, everything crumbled. My father passed away last month, and in his will, he made Kyle the sole inheritor of the business. I was still left as CEO with a decent salary, but the decision-making power, that was Kyle's. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I had given everything to this company, my time, my career, my passion, and in return, my father's will pushed me aside. When I confronted my mom, hoping she had some insight, she sighed, confirming that my dad had mentioned it to her. "Your father thought it would teach Kyle responsibility," she said, her eyes unable to meet mine. She added that having me around to guide him would help. It was insulting. My years of dedication boiled down to me being a glorified babysitter for my irresponsible younger brother. Despite my mother's attempts to pacify me, saying I'd still make a good salary, it was never about the money. It was the sheer lack of respect. After days of internal turmoil, I made the hardest decision of my life. I quit. I wasn't about to work for someone as reckless as Kyle, and I certainly wasn't going to take orders from him while he played at being in charge. I had enough savings to take a break and figure out my next move, and with my experience, I knew I'd land on my feet. But walking away wasn't easy. Memories of my time at the company haunted me. Every day I questioned if leaving was right. Kyle, on the other hand, dove headfirst into his new role, and it didn't take long for things to start unraveling. Kyle was always lazy and impulsive, and as kids, he loved the good life without ever thinking about what it took to maintain it. He'd spend recklessly, never taking work seriously. When my dad needed us most, Kyle refused to step up, choosing parties and indulgence over responsibility. I hoped that being handed the company would force him to change. I even tried to give him advice, but he brushed me off each time, claiming he had everything under control. It became evident he didn't. He hired friends who had no idea what they were doing, splurged on extravagant parties, and drained company funds without thought. Clients noticed, and soon, dissatisfaction grew. When Kyle announced plans to branch into manufacturing, a risky move that I had deliberately avoided due to the complications, I knew it was doomed. It had been my dad's dream, but it required careful strategy. Kyle wasn't ready. Within 6 months, everything fell apart. The products were subpar, no distributors wanted them, and the company lost money. The headlines buzzed with the company's downfall. I started getting calls from employees pleading for me to return. I'll admit, there was a moment where I almost did. But then I remembered the betrayal and Kyle's arrogant refusal to listen. He needed to learn the hard way. When Kyle called me, desperation in his voice, begging me to come back and help, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. He even tried to tempt me with more money, but it was never about the money. I told him that if he stepped down and handed over the company, I'd consider it. He refused. Now the company is nearly bankrupt, and Kyle has been abandoned by his so-called friends. Most employees have been let go or quit, and the business, once the pride of our family, is on the brink of extinction. I won't lie, it's tempting to gloat. Kyle had made working there miserable for me, and now he's paying the price. But seeing the company my family built crumble, that stings too. Even so, I don't regret walking away. Sometimes the hardest lessons come at the highest cost. After quitting, I took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown. The first few weeks were strange. I wasn't used to the quiet or having so much time to myself. There were moments I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, ready to check emails or follow up on client issues, only to remember that it wasn't my problem anymore. The initial relief of leaving behind the chaos gave way to a gnawing emptiness. But I had to keep reminding myself why I walked away in the first place. Kyle's reckless decisions weren't my responsibility anymore. In those early weeks, whispers about the company's decline reached me through mutual acquaintances and old colleagues. Kyle's so-called management was a train wreck. He'd hired his unqualified friends and spent company funds on flashy parties, thinking it would build connections and strengthen the brand. Instead, he alienated loyal clients who had worked with us for years. I knew he was in over his head, but I wasn't going to step in and fix it. Not this time. I was tempted when I started getting desperate calls and messages from employees I'd once managed and mentored. They begged me to come back, to save their jobs, to save the company. Guilt gnawed at me, but I stayed firm. If I rushed in to rescue Kyle, he'd never learn, and I'd be right back where I started, working under someone who didn't deserve the role. Then, Kyle called. It was late at night, and my phone buzzed relentlessly until I picked up. He sounded worn out and desperate in a way I'd never heard before. He launched into a frantic rundown of the problems: lost clients, bad products, dwindling finances. I listened in silence, half expecting an apology or acknowledgement of how things turned out. Instead, he asked if I would come back and help steer the ship. When I asked him if he'd be willing to step down, he laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. He offered me more money and insisted that he'd take my advice, but the arrogance was still there. He was still the one holding the reins, refusing to let go. Not happening, I said, cutting him off. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. I hung up, heart thudding with a mix of anger and regret. It wasn't easy. It would have been simpler to go back, fix things, and take control. But I knew that if I did, I'd be stuck under him forever, caught in the cycle of rescuing someone who never learned to appreciate it. The company's collapse sped up after that call. Kyle tried expanding into manufacturing, but it was a disaster. The quality of the products was awful, so bad that not a single distributor would touch them. I knew the headaches that came with that side of the business. It was one of the reasons I'd put off my dad's dream of expanding in that direction. But Kyle? He rushed in without considering the consequences. He thought he could fix everything with a show of confidence and expensive promises. But business doesn't work like that. Every day, more bad news about the company spread. Headlines about financial losses, poor management, and discontented clients became the norm. People I used to work with were laid off or left, unable to handle the sinking ship. Even clients who had been with us for decades pulled out. Kyle was out of his depth, and the weight of it was crushing him. Then, one evening, I got a text from an old colleague. "It's bad, man. They're letting more people go. Everyone's jumping ship. Just thought you should know." I stared at the message, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with the cold reality of vindication. I'd spent years trying to hold everything together, sacrificing my career and my peace of mind, and now it was falling apart under Kyle's so-called leadership. Eventually, Kyle reached out again, this time in person. He showed up at my door looking worn down, eyes hollow, and clothes disheveled. The confident, carefree guy I knew was gone, replaced by someone I almost felt sorry for. "Almost," he said, his voice strained. "I messed up. I need your help." He was finally admitting it, but it was too late for apologies. "Are you willing to step down?" I asked, crossing my arms. He flinched, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "I can't do that," he muttered, "but I'm willing to make you an equal partner." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's never been about the money, Kyle. It was about respect, and you made it clear how much you value that." I didn't wait for him to respond. I shut the door and walked away. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a mix of anger, pity, and relief. Kyle was facing the consequences, and it was brutal. The employees, the legacy, everything was suffering because of his arrogance. Part of me ached for the business, my great-grandfather's dream, my father's pride. But another part of me felt justified. I'd done my best, and now Kyle was facing the fallout of his choices. Weeks turned into months, and the company's downfall was undeniable. Headlines confirmed what I already knew. The company was bankrupt. Kyle lost everything. His friends left him, and the flashy lifestyle he loved so much was stripped away. Most of the employees had moved on, finding work elsewhere. The office that once buzzed with life was now silent. My phone still buzzed occasionally with updates from friends and former colleagues, but I kept my distance. I knew going back would only bring more heartache and resentment. This was a lesson Kyle needed to learn on his own, and I couldn't save him from it, even if I wanted to. Kyle's downfall was the talk of the town. The once bustling office was now a ghost of its former self, filled with empty desks and abandoned files. The employees who hadn't been let go had already moved on to better opportunities, and those who stayed behind did so out of sheer loyalty or desperation. The business my father and grandfather had spent their lives building was now reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. I thought seeing Kyle fail would make me feel triumphant, maybe even satisfied. Instead, all I felt was a hollow ache. Watching something that had been in my family for generations crumble like that was harder than I'd ever imagined. The thought of my father's expression if he were still alive haunted me. He had his flaws, sure, but he didn't deserve to see his legacy end this way. Kyle, on the other hand, was a wreck. I'd heard through mutual contacts that he'd had to sell his flashy car in the penthouse he'd impulsively bought during his first few weeks as boss. He was now living in a tiny, rundown apartment on the other side of town. The friends who'd flocked to his parties and enjoyed the benefits of his reckless spending had all disappeared. I imagined him sitting alone, surrounded by silence, facing the reality of his failures. But despite everything, he never called me again. The message was clear. His pride still outweighed his sense of responsibility, even when it left him with nothing. Meanwhile, I was trying to piece my life back together. I'd been applying for jobs, leveraging the skills and experience I'd accumulated during my years running the company. The job market wasn't great, but I wasn't too worried. I knew my worth, and I was confident that something would come through. Still, there was a gnawing uncertainty, that feeling of being caught between the past and the future, trying to move on while part of me was stuck looking over my shoulder. The guilt was the hardest part. It wasn't just the company that suffered, it was the employees, the people who'd trusted me to lead them, and who were now scattered, searching for stability elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let them down. I reminded myself over and over that staying wouldn't have changed anything. It would have just tied me to the ship as it sank. One afternoon, I got a call from Lily, an old colleague who'd been at the company since before I joined. She'd always been like a big sister, the type of person who could keep the office running smoothly even when chaos loomed. We hadn't talked since I left, and hearing her voice brought back a rush of memories. Hey, Alex, she said, a hint of hesitation in her voice. I just wanted you to know that most of us don't blame you. We knew you did everything you could. It wasn't your failure. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Thanks, Lily. I needed to hear that. There was a pause, then she added, Rumor has it, Kyle's trying to sell what's left of the company. Apparently, he's desperate. The news didn't surprise me, but it still stung. Selling off the remnants of the business felt like the final nail in the coffin. Part of me wanted to reach out to at least try to save what was left, but I knew it was too late. Kyle would never admit defeat, not to me. Days turned into weeks, and I focused on my job search. Finally, I landed a position at a promising startup. It wasn't what I was used to. I wasn't the one calling the shots, but it felt good to be part of something growing, something new. The work was demanding, and the environment was fast-paced, but I thrived in it. It was a reminder that I still had value, that my skills hadn't disappeared just because I'd walked away from the family business. Meanwhile, news about Kyle grew scarce. The last I heard, he'd managed to sell what little was left of the company and he was struggling to make ends meet. The legacy my father and grandfather built was officially gone. It should have been a relief, a closure of sorts, but instead, it left a pit in my stomach. My mom called every now and then. She tried to keep the conversation light, pretending that everything was fine even though we both knew it wasn't. I couldn't hold her responsible for what happened, but the way she'd sided with my father's decision without a word still hurt. I loved her, but things were different now. Are you okay, Alex? She'd ask, her voice soft and tentative. I quote, "Ma fine, Mom," I'd lie, forcing a smile even though she couldn't see it. And then, one day, Kyle showed up at my door again. He looked worse than before, if that was even possible. His eyes were hollow, and he had the kind of tiredness that only came from carrying the weight of too many regrets. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face him, but I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the middle of my small living room, shifting uncomfortably, as if he didn't know where to start. Finally, he met my eyes. I sold the company, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's gone. I nodded, not knowing what to say. What do you say to someone who just admitted to destroying something so significant? I thought I could do it, he continued, the words tumbling out as if he'd been holding them in for months. I thought I knew better than you, better than Dad, but I didn't. I screwed up. There it was. The apology I'd been waiting for, but now that it was here, it felt hollow, almost too late. I wish you'd listened sooner, I said, my voice steady but emotionless. Yeah, he said, rubbing his face. Me too. We stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I wanted to feel angry, to throw the blame at him and tell him how he'd destroyed everything our family worked for. But instead, I just felt tired. Tired of carrying the anger. Tired of holding on to the past. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but for the first time, I saw Kyle not as the arrogant brother who took everything for granted, but as someone who was lost. Just as I'd been. I quote, "Ma'am, not going to fix this for you," I finally said. "But I hope you find a way to fix yourself." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. And then, without another word, he left. Kyle's visit lingered in my mind long after he walked out the door. I expected to feel relieved, maybe even justified, but instead I felt a strange mix of sadness and exhaustion. The brother who had always been a carefree, reckless shadow in my life was now broken, and the pieces were his to pick up. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my new job. It was tough going from being the leader of a company to just another employee, but it was what I needed. There was something freeing about not having to make every decision, not having to carry the weight of an entire legacy on my back. The startup environment was vibrant, full of people who were hungry to build something from the ground up. I found myself staying late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not weighed down by old expectations or family ties. But the past has a way of creeping back in. One evening, after a long day at the office, I got a call from my mom. I could hear the strain in her voice before she even spoke. "Kyle's not doing well," she said. There was a pause, a hesitation that made my chest tighten. He's lost." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't my problem, that Kyle's mess was his own doing, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just listened as she recounted how he'd been drifting from job to job, barely scraping by. The image of my brother, once cocky and full of bravado, now reduced to someone who couldn't find his footing, made something in me crack. No matter how much he'd hurt me, he was still my brother. I didn't rush to help him, though. I'd done enough rescuing in my life. I focused on building my new life and finding my own sense of purpose. The startup was growing, and so was my role in it. I made new connections, found new mentors, and discovered a part of myself that I thought had died in the old office. It felt good to be valued for my skills, to be respected without having to prove myself day after day to someone who saw me as a second choice. Kyle faded into the background of my life, just another part of my past that I was trying to move on from. But one day, I ran into him by accident at a small cafe near my apartment. He looked thinner, worn down in a way that went deeper than the physical. He glanced up, our eyes met, and for a moment we both froze. "Alex," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. I nodded, unsure what to say. He gestured awkwardly to the chair across from him. "Want to sit?" I hesitated, the years of resentment and betrayal bubbling up before I pushed them back down. I sat. We talked cautiously at first, like we were stepping around broken glass. He told me how hard it had been to find work after the company fell, and how people looked at him with that knowing glance that said, "You're the one who ruined it." He'd been living with that shame for a while now, and it showed. "I thought I could make it up to Dad," he said, his eyes locked on the table. "I thought if I could just make the company better, I'd be worth something. The rawness in his voice took me off guard. For the first time, I saw past the arrogance, past the pride. He'd been trying to prove himself, just in the wrong way. I didn't feel the rush of vindication I thought I would. Instead, I felt a pang of something close to understanding. Kyle, it was never about proving anything, I said. It was about doing what was right for the company, for the people who worked there, and for us. But you never saw that. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. "I know that now. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the cafe filling the space between us. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something. A small step toward understanding. We weren't suddenly brothers who were going to hug it out and fix years of resentment in one conversation, but it was a start. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to walk away. "Are you going to be okay?" I finally asked, my voice softer than I intended. He met my eyes, and I saw the flicker of hope that had been missing for so long. "I think so. I'm trying. That was all I needed to hear." I stood up, leaving a few bills on the table for my coffee. "Good." As I walked out of the cafe, a strange sense of closure settled over me. Kyle's life was his to fix, and mine was finally mine to build. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, and that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and I dove deeper into my new role at the startup. I learned to appreciate the little victories, the late-night brainstorms that led to breakthroughs, the camaraderie with my team, the satisfaction of seeing projects come to life. For the first time in years, I felt proud, not because I was trying to uphold someone else's dream, but because I was building my own. Every now and then, I'd get a call from my mom, updating me on Kyle. He was making slow progress, working odd jobs, trying to rebuild what he'd broken. It wasn't my job to save him, but it felt good to know he was trying. We weren't close, not by any stretch, but there was no more bitterness gnawing at me. I still thought about the old company sometimes, especially on quiet nights when memories crept in uninvited. But the sting was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. I'd given it my all, and when the time came, I'd chosen myself. That choice had cost me, but it had also set me free. Months turned into a year, and life kept moving forward. The startup I joined was thriving, and I was right there in the middle of it, climbing my way back to a leadership position, but this time on my terms. The thrill of seeing something succeed, not because of family obligation, but because of hard work and collaboration, was unmatched. I had built relationships with my new team that reminded me of the good times I once had at the family business before everything went sideways. Kyle and I spoke occasionally. It was never anything deep, just updates here and there. He'd managed to get a steady job working for a logistics company. Nothing glamorous, but it was honest work. The last time we talked, he'd sounded more grounded than I'd heard in years. He told me about the new apartment he'd moved into, a small but decent place he could afford on his own. It was a far cry from the penthouse he once flaunted, but he seemed almost relieved to have something modest, something real. Our conversations were polite, civil even, but they weren't what anyone would call close. I think we both knew it would take more than a few shared moments in a cafe or a phone call to rebuild what we'd lost. But there was no anger left, no burning resentment eating away at me. That in itself was a victory. One afternoon, I got an unexpected call from my mom. "Alex, your dad's old friend Mr. Turner is hosting a business mixer. He asked if you'd come." I hadn't seen Mr. Turner in years. He was practically family growing up, always around for holidays and events. He'd watched my brother and me grow up and had always been a sounding board for my dad. I almost said no, the past still too fresh, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the curiosity of seeing familiar faces after so long, or maybe it was the part of me that wanted to show I was okay, that I'd come out the other side better, stronger. The mixer was held in a small event space downtown, nothing flashy but full of familiar faces. The air was warm with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and laughter that carried stories of better days. I spotted Mr. Turner near the back, grayer than I remembered, but with the same twinkle in his eye. "Alex, there you are," he called out, pulling me into a bear hug. "Good to see you, Sundot." We talked for a while, exchanging stories about the old days, catching up on life. It was good, in a nostalgic kind of way, but it also reminded me of what was gone. My father's name came up a few times, always with a hint of sadness. People spoke about the old company with regret, how it had been a staple in the community, a symbol of hard work and resilience. I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't sharp like before. It was more of an echo, a reminder of what once was. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kyle. He stood near the entrance, looking a little out of place in his simple suit. He scanned the room nervously until his eyes met mine. For a second, we both froze. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey," he said, his voice steady but careful. "I didn't know you'd be here. Same," I replied. The tension between us was palpable, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of tension that comes when you're navigating unfamiliar territory. We stood there, exchanging small talk, each sentence feeling like a test of how far we'd come. Mr. Turner walked over and clapped Kyle on the back. "Good to see the Wright brothers together again," he said with a laugh, unaware of the irony. Kyle and I exchanged a glance, a hint of a shared smile passing between us. As the night went on, the conversations loosened, the edges of old memories smoothed over by laughter and shared stories. Kyle and I even ended up sitting at the same table. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel forced. It wasn't the kind of easy camaraderie we had as kids, but something. We talked about life, about work, and even joked about our mom's attempts to check in on us more than we needed. By the end of the night, as people trickled out and the noise faded, Kyle turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Sincerity. "Alex, I'm sorry for everything," he said, the words heavier than any we'd spoken before. "Not just for the company, but for how I treated you. I know it took losing everything for me to see it." I nodded, letting the words settle between us. "I know, Kyle, and I'm sorry too. For walking away, for not trying harder to make you listen, ... He shook his head. "You did what you had to do. I see that now, ... It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was honest, and it was enough. We weren't going to fix everything in one night, but we were on the path to something better. even if it was just understanding. As I walked out into the crisp night air, the city lights casting a warm glow over the streets, I felt a strange sense of peace. The past was still there, but it no longer defined me. The lessons were learned, the weight lifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, moving forward, one step at a time. Story 2. After I gave their golden child a kidney, their parents ejected me and now want me to take care of them. As a result, I was always aware of my position within the family. The golden kid was my half-brother, and I was, well, the backup, the one who was there to cover for him when necessary, but wasn't really that essential. Otherwise, it wasn't as if it had ever been spoken out. Actions, comma. However, do speak louder, don't they? It seemed as though everything had to halt for him to get the treatment he needed, even academics. Whatever I was doing, I had to stop. Guess who was preparing the snack if you wanted one? Yes, me? But it wasn't simply little matters. My entire existence was molded to fit his needs or desires. He seemed to be at the center of every choice made in the house. It was like to being in the shadow of someone else. However, I wasn't even permitted to briefly enter the light. One particular recollection that comes to mind is our childhood. I could have been 10 or so. I was really looking forward to this school assignment. It was a science fair activity where you had to construct a volcano or something. I made sure everything was flawless by preparing it for weeks. My brother had a cold the night before the big day. It's just the sniffles. Nothing serious. However, my father, man, oh man, it would seem like the end of the world. To care for him, he put everything on hold, but I pleaded to go to the fair. Not at all. Family comes first. They meant my brother when they said family. That was only one instance. Millions more were out there. His requirements took precedence over all of my birthday celebrations. Every vacation, every journey, he was always the focus. I recall that we were organizing a family vacation, which I had been anticipating for some months. As I dreamed about all the amazing things we do, I had saved up my allowance. My brother then decided he didn't want to travel a few days prior. You know what? The trip has been canceled. No dialogue, no concession. Just, we must ensure that he is at ease. He wasn't exactly this awful guy either. Simply put, he was accustomed to being the focus of attention. My stepmother and father ensured that. They would never stop talking about how unique he was and how much additional attention he required. Me? All I did was take up the slack. I stopped bothering to beg for things at one point. What was the purpose? It wasn't happening if it didn't help my brother. Don't misunderstand me. I understand that children occasionally require more support or care. However, this wasn't always the case. This was true every day. I couldn't even recall a moment when I thought I was as important as he was. It seemed as though I was the fallback option, the spare in case the main event didn't work out. It even affected school. I did well in school, nothing very noteworthy. However, I made an effort. I dreamed of attending college and making a difference in the world. My dad, however, had other ideas. Guess who was tutoring my brother whenever he needed help with schoolwork, and if I ever required assistance? Okay, bad luck. You have to figure things out for yourself. I once took an exam and had a quite poor grade. I felt awful when I got home and hoped that someone would take notice. Rather, my father lectured me on the necessity to put in more effort. However, my brother's report card showed a C on the second dot. Everything from additional study time to full-time intervention instructors. It enraged me. The continual reminder that family ties people together just made things worse. Since I could walk, the statement has been ingrained in my mind. However, their true intention was for me to remain with them. They owed me less than I owed them. It all came down to what I could do for my brother and the rest of the family. Then there were the little gestures, the tiny jabs that accumulated over time. For example, my father would give my brother praise for even the tiniest accomplishments, while seldom mentioning anything I accomplished. It was a party if my brother cleaned his room. Perhaps those little moments that gnawed at me made me understand that I would never be adequate in their eyes, even if I aced an exam or received a nod. The most painful thing, in my opinion, was how commonplace everything became. I began to think that perhaps my value had diminished. Perhaps I wasn't meant to have my own aspirations or objectives. Perhaps my only goal was to support my brother and see to it that he had all he required. It was draining. I regret not advocating for myself more in the past. However, it might be difficult when you're a child and everyone tells you that this is the way things are. I lacked the courage and the language to resist. I simply swallowed my emotions, accepted it, and continued. I didn't begin to notice the flaws in the facade until I was older. The more I considered it, The more I saw how dysfunctional it was, no child should have to feel inferior to their own family as they grow up. However, the harm had already been done when I discovered that. I'd already put off taking care of myself for years, for the benefit of family. That was my life, though, always in the background. Giving without expecting anything in return is always anticipated. And to be honest, it really influenced who I am now, not in a positive sense. I'll talk about that later, though. For now, simply know that it was difficult and left wounds to grow up as the other child in a household that solely had eyes for my brother. I'm still struggling. My half-brother's illness was the catalyst for everything. Not a simple case of the flu or whatever, but a serious illness. It's the type of illness when the world seems to be falling apart and physicians start using frightening language. I still recall the day they informed us that he required a kidney transplant. My stepmother and father were pacing the room in a panic, unsure of what to do. The experts clarified that obtaining a donor was crucial and that dialysis was simply a short-term fix. At that point, everyone's attention was on me. Before I could even comprehend what was occurring, they began discussing testing family members. According to the physicians, it is typical for siblings to match. My dad was nodding along as if everything were already agreed upon before I had a chance to consider. You quote, "Re going to be tested, Michael?" As if it weren't even a question, my dad said. As if that were just expected. What should I have said? I couldn't say no, of course. My dad's pressure wasn't the only factor. For years, the entire family issue was ingrained in my mind. Isn't family a cohesive unit? I thus concurred. What more was there for me to do? The testing procedure was drawn out and, to be honest, somewhat intrusive. I didn't completely comprehend blood testing, tissue matching, and other things at the time. I wasn't really considering the significance of it all. I was just going through the motions. The day the findings were unexpectedly revealed finally arrived. I was the ideal fit. Everyone felt a sense of relief. For what seemed like the first time in years, my dad gave me a hug. My stepmother sobbed as she repeatedly thanked me. It was too much. It should have made me feel fantastic, right? As if I were doing something really big and noble for my brother. But I was secretly afraid. The procedure was arranged in a flash. They wanted to avoid wasting time. Hospital appointments, paperwork, and uncomfortable family meals when nobody really knew what to say were all part of the hazy days before it. Although he was shy and likely afraid as well, my brother never really talked to me about it. It seemed as though we both understood what had to be done. Thus, we simply accepted it. The day of the procedure arrived sooner than I had anticipated. I recall trying to reassure myself that everything would be well while I lay on that hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. But I couldn't get rid of the nagging suspicion that this would be the turning point in my life. And it did. Not in the manner I had assumed. The actual procedure proceeded according to plan. My brother received one of my kidneys after it was removed. According to the doctor, we were both anticipated to recover well, and everything appeared to be in order. I felt like I had been struck by a vehicle and was hospitalized for a few days. However, I was glad it was finished. I hoped that things would be different now. Perhaps my family had respected or valued me in some way. However, no. Reality hit me hard as soon as I arrived home. I was once again invisible since my dad and stepmother were so preoccupied with my brother's recuperation. They hardly even noticed my actions. He was the main focus. What he needed and how he felt. I was left to heal myself, emotionally and physically spent, and not even a simple thank you. About a week following the procedure, I tried to bring it up one evening. I informed my father that I was having trouble, that I was hurting, and that I needed assistance. His answer, "You'll be all right. Right now, your brother is more in need of us." That phrase stayed with me. It felt like a face slap. It wasn't enough even though I had just literally handed up a piece of myself. My wants were unimportant. They didn't. The worst thing? Physical rehabilitation was only one aspect of it. It was a cruel emotional toll. I began to feel very unimportant. I was only there to support the family when they needed me. After fulfilling that function, I was thrown away. In the end, my brother recovered. He had recovered and was returning to his life by going to follow-up checkups. I was left to pick up my bits in the interim. I tried discussing it with others, but it's difficult to describe the sense of emptiness you get when you're treated more like a tool than a person by your own family. I couldn't stop reflecting on all the things I'd given up over the years, including my time, my goals, and now a physical part of my body. For what purpose? To be discarded as soon as I became useless. I wish I could say I took a stand for myself at that moment. However, it wasn't. I simply continued stepping forward 1 foot at a time. I'm trying to persuade myself that they might consider me for more than simply backup someday. However, that day never arrived, and my brother had a terrible day one day, and despite my negative feelings, I began to assist. However, I was expelled rather than receiving any encouragement or even a thank you. In order to focus on my brother's recuperation, my dad and stepmother felt they didn't need me around. That conversation is still fresh in my mind. Really, it wasn't really a discussion. One day, my dad approached me. I probably told them to find another place to stay 2 weeks after I left the hospital. That was it. There, quote, "S no reason why your brother doesn't need silence." I wasn't exactly making a scene. I was still getting better myself, and most days I could not move from my bed without feeling like I was about to pass out. Consequently, I packed up what little I had. There was nowhere for me to go. No backup plan, no savings. I crashed on a friend's couch in the end. In addition, a shout out to Dave. Back then, he truly rescued my ass. However, after a time, I felt like I was staying too long there. I was a half-broken man attempting to put his life back together after Dave had taken care of his own. It was difficult to find job. The majority of the jobs I could find were physically taxing, and I wasn't in the right frame of mind to perform much physical labor, but I had to do something. I thus began working shifts at a nearby diner. Even though the hours were long and the compensation wasn't fantastic, I could at least help with the rent and purchase some food. However, the physical aspects weren't the most difficult. It was the psychological cost. I felt very alone. In an attempt to determine what went wrong, I continued playing everything over in my mind. Why wasn't I sufficient? Why did my stepmother and father feel that it was acceptable to simply throw me out like that? I would occasionally learn about them through rumors, neighbors and mutual pals, unrelated individuals who remained in contact. My sibling was doing well. He was, of course, back at college and going about his life as if nothing had occurred. I was working really hard to maintain food in my stomach and a roof over my head in the meanwhile. I was also in terrible health. My anemia after the operation made it difficult for me to get out of bed on certain days. After dragging myself to work and persevering through the shifts, I passed out at Dave's house. I wanted to give up at times, but I was unable to. That was not really an option for me. I had no one else to help me pick up the pieces. I was walking home after a late shift one evening. I was without a suitable jacket, and it was chilly. I recall thinking that was ironic. While my family was likely comfortable at home and not thinking about me, here I was, fighting to remain warm and nourished. I was really impacted by that stroll home. I became acutely aware of my isolation as a result. I made many attempts to contact my dad in the hopes that he would change his mind. I would text him to apprise him on my situation. I would either be ignored or receive a brief, uninteresting response if I asked if we could chat. "I hope you're busy with your brother or doing well." That was it. They seemed to no longer even recognize me. In an attempt to lift my spirits, Dave would reassure me that I could manage without them, and I truly did appreciate it. However, it's difficult to get rid of the sense that your own family does not want you. Reminding you that you weren't good enough is like having a weight on your chest all the time. A few months in, one of the worst incidents occurred. I was attempting to concentrate at work when a mutual buddy called. They talked about how my brother's recuperation and return to school were being celebrated with a party hosted by my dad and stepmother. Naturally, I wasn't invited. That was painful. Hearing about it made everything hurt anew, even though I didn't anticipate an invitation. When I got home that evening, I just sat on the bed's edge and gazed at the wall. I was unable to comprehend it. They couldn't even think about me, even though I sacrificed a piece of myself for them. I made the decision to give up attempting to get in touch at that point. They had obviously made up their minds, and I had nothing to do with it. The months that followed were a haze of effort and fatigue. I persisted in my efforts to create something for myself. There were many nights when I barely survived, and it wasn't easy. However, I gradually came to terms with the fact that I was alone. In retrospect, I believe those months were among the most difficult in my life. The individuals who ought to have supported me were nowhere to be seen, and I felt like I was struggling all the time simply to stay afloat. Although that was a tough lesson, I had to learn it. Although I didn't want to struggle alone, I learned a lot about perseverance from it. I discovered that if I wanted a better life, I had to create it for myself and that I couldn't rely on anybody else. And even though it hurt, the process strengthened me. I hadn't heard from my dad in years. To be honest, I didn't think I would ever hear from him again. I assumed we were done after all that transpired, including being ejected and left on my own. However, my phone suddenly buzzed, and there it was. My father's message. "Can we chat, please? It's crucial." I initially believed that may be an error. He could have intended to text someone else. Why, after all, would he want to speak now? However, my curiosity overcame me and I said, "Sure." What is going on? He got back to me right away and asked if we could meet up. That was somewhat unexpected. He had urged me to pack and go, and I hadn't seen him since. My instinct told me not to go. However, I felt compelled to understand his desires. We decided to get together in a little cafe close to my place of employment. I arrived a little early, nerves taking over. I had no idea what to anticipate. Would he say sorry? Would he attempt to coerce me into doing something? All of the options were flying through my head. I could scarcely recognize him when he entered. He appeared older, even more exhausted. Life seems to have worn him down. There was an unsettling stillness for a time when he sat down across from me. We had no idea where to begin. At last he said something. Things about you that surprised me have been on my mind a lot. It was unusual for him to mention me, at least not in a way that made me feel important. He went on, I know I haven't been there for you. However, I need your assistance because things have been difficult. It was there, the true purpose of the gathering. I sensed that I was becoming more vigilant. I knew better than to down my defenses too soon. What sort of assistance? Trying to speak in a neutral tone, I asked. Gazing down at the table, he let out a sigh. I am in a bit of a predicament. We're having trouble making our mortgage payments. I can't work as much as I used to because of my poor health. We need a place to stay because we have a lot of debt. As he spoke, I sat there taking it all in. After everything I endured at their hands, after dismissing me as if I were inconsequential. He was now requesting my assistance. It seemed unreal. Would you like to live with me? I questioned, attempting to comprehend it. He gave a nod. For as long as it takes us to get back on our feet. After all those years of battling alone, I was shocked to learn that he wanted to re-enter my life because he needed something from me. I couldn't decide whether to scream or laugh. Why now? At last, I inquired. After all this time, why come to me? After he paused, he spoke. Your brother's fiancé wasn't on board when we attempted to question him. There was nowhere else for us to go. That was like a kick to the stomach. I was therefore the final option, not the first option, not even the second, only the fallback option, as usual. I reclined in my seat, absorbing the gravity of the circumstance. A part of me felt terrible for him, but another part of me wanted to tell him precisely where he could go. He appeared desperate, and in spite of everything, I harbored a glimmer of optimism that perhaps, just possibly, this could be an opportunity to make amends. Then I recalled all the evenings I had to fight by myself. Every time I reached out for help or recognition, I received nothing in return. I was unable to just forget that. I tried to sound steady as I responded, I don't know, Dad. When I most needed you, you ejected me. You're requesting that I take you in now. There is a lot to take in. As if he understood, he nodded. I am aware of my errors. I'm attempting to make amends, even though I know I've harmed you. I'm requesting a chance. I wanted to think he was real. Yes, I did. However, trust doesn't arise out of thin air. You have to earn it. He also needed to cover a lot of ground. Finally, I responded, I'll give it some thought. However, I require time. With a slightly relieved expression, he nodded once again. All I'm requesting is that. For several more minutes, we sat there without discussing anything specific. When we eventually left ways, it seemed uncomfortable, like two strangers attempting to find some common ground. I had a range of feelings. I felt a twinge of rage, a part of me felt depressed, and I was a little perplexed. I thought about that chat for the following few days. I kept playing it over and over in my mind as I tried to decide what to do. On the one hand, I still wanted to assist since he was my father. However, I couldn't deny the suffering he had inflicted upon me. Ultimately, I realized that I had to make a difficult choice, and that it would not be simple no matter what I choose. I believed I would have some time to collect myself and consider my options after our cafe rendezvous. However, no. I didn't have much leeway from my parents. My phone began to overflow with texts a few days later. Simple messages like, "Have you thought about what we talked about?" were all that was sent at initially. Or do we actually need your assistance? I disregarded them in the hopes that he would retreat, but he wasn't. He phoned the following day. To be honest, I wasn't prepared for another chat, so I let it go to voicemail. However, when I listened to the message, he seemed really serious. It's your dad, Michael. Although I am aware of your hectic schedule, this is crucial. Give me a call back, please. I kept getting the impression that he would just keep pressing if I didn't at least listen to him. I immediately realized that this would not be a casual conversation when I phoned him back. I didn't want to bother you, Michael, but I've been thinking about our last conversation, he added. I have some things to explain. Here we go, I said. All right, I'm paying attention. He began by giving a speech to the entire family. You're aware of it, how a family remains united, how we should support one another during difficult times. Even though I had heard the same things all my life, something seemed different today, as if he were wielding a weapon. Your mother would have preferred that you assist. That was thrown in like a low blow, he remarked. She thought that family and looking out for one another were important. She would be pleased of you for taking charge, I'm sure. That was a powerful blow. It felt like a cheap shot to bring up my mother, who had died when I was younger. He was exploiting the fact that he knew I loved her to make me feel guilty. I remained silent in an effort to take in what he was saying without becoming upset. He went on, I know I wasn't perfect. I erred. But Michael, we're family. Family also extends forgiveness. Family members support one another. I sensed the pressure increasing. I understood precisely what he was doing as he laid it on thick. It wasn't about mending our friendship or making apologies. He wanted me to take them in and clean up their mess, so that was the goal. I eventually said, Dad, I understand what you're saying. However, you must realize that I find this difficult. I can't be expected to forget everything and act as though nothing is wrong. He let out a sigh, as if my reaction had disappointed him. I am not requesting that you forget. Please put the past behind you and concentrate on what matters right now. He then detonated yet another explosive. No, your brother won't. He has his own worries and his own existence. However, you have always been the one in charge. We've always known we could rely on you. It was there, the ultimate trip of guilt. The golden kid, my brother, had his own life, so he was off the hook. But since I was the one in charge, I was supposed to pick up the pieces. The tale was the same. It's just another chapter. I've always been responsible, Dad, I remarked, a little trembling in my voice. I've already made a lot of sacrifices. For this family, I sacrificed a piece of me. What did I receive in exchange? I was expelled. I understand, he continued, his tone becoming softer. And I apologize for it. Yes, I am. But Michael, we're in a difficult situation. If it wasn't serious, I wouldn't inquire. Instead of screaming and telling him how unjust it was to force this on me, I took a deep breath and made an effort to remain composed. I need time to reflect. In the hopes of gaining some space, I said. He responded, take your time. But I could sense the hurry in his tone. Just keep in mind what your mother would have desired. Long after the call ended, I couldn't get that sentence out of my head. I was shocked that he had guilted me into helping by using my mother's memory. He seemed to know just where to strike to give me the worst feeling. What's the worst? It was functioning. Even though my mother wasn't around to witness it, I struggled with wanting to maintain my position and not wanting to disappoint her. I kept replaying the discussion in my mind throughout the course of the following several days. My chest tensed each time I considered it. It was difficult for me to concentrate on anything else because of the guilt that was eating away at me. It wasn't any easier to ignore him even though I understood what he was doing. I discussed it with a few close friends in an effort to understand their viewpoint. The same thing was said by all of them. There is nothing you owe him. He should be apologizing and not requesting favors after what he has done to you. Of course, they were correct. However, feeling it was not the same as knowing it. Each time I considered refusing. I would be reminded of my dad's remarks about my mother by that tiny voice in my brain. My heart and mind were engaged in a tug of war. Ultimately, I realized I needed to choose. However, I was aware that there would be no turning back from my decision. My dad contacted me once again a few days after our previous conversation. He wasn't only leaving voicemails or texts this time. He arrived at my house. I didn't anticipate him. I was thus taken aback when I opened the door and found him standing there. His appearance worsened, weary, worn out, as if he hadn't gotten any sleep in days. We need to talk, Michael, he remarked in a tremulous voice. After a brief moment of hesitation, I moved aside to let him enter. In the living room, we took a seat. There was a heavy quiet between us. It was clear to me that this would not be a friendly conversation. I've been pressuring you. I know that. His hands fumbled in his lap as he began, and I apologize for it. However, things have deteriorated. Our alternatives are dwindling. I remained silent so he could speak. I was curious to know his thoughts. Despite the fact that I already knew where this was headed, we tried everything. He went on. What we could sell, we did. Reduce spending. However, it is insufficient. The house is about to be lost. It was difficult to hear him say that. Even though I had distanced myself from them, the thought of my dad losing the house we had shared for so long still made me sad. However, I couldn't deny what had transpired. It was more complicated than simply unlocking my door and allowing them to enter. He said, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You're correct too. We should have treated you better, but we did not. I should have treated you differently. I was surprised by it. I didn't anticipate an apology, not one that seemed so real in particular. His voice cracked as he replied, I let you down. I forgot about you since I was so preoccupied with your brother, and ever then, I've regretted it. I was momentarily at a loss for words. There was a part of me that wanted to trust him, to take the apologies, and to go on. However, a part of me continued to harbor all the hurt and bitterness. I apologize, he said again. Tears were streaming from his eyes. We have nowhere else to go, so even though I know I can't undo the past, I'm asking for your assistance right now. Then, an unexpected event occurred. My dad started crying uncontrollably and sobbed into his hands. He had never looked like that to me before. He was always the tough, unyielding kind, the man who controlled his emotions. It was startling to see him like way. I'm at a loss on what to do. Through his tears, he said, I've always made an effort to maintain my composure, but I'm no longer able to do it. Michael, I need your aid. I need your assistance. I had always thought of this man as unbreakable, so it was difficult to witness him crumble in front of me. It made me feel something. This mixture of grief, rage, and intense, heartbreaking pity. I'm at a loss for words. With a faltering voice, I confessed, that's a lot. I am aware. Wiping his face, he said, furthermore, I am aware that I have no right to inquire after everything. I'm desperate, though. For a time, we sat there in quiet, the moment's weight bearing down on us both. I could sense the internal struggle pulling me apart. He was my father on the one hand, and it broke my heart to see him like way. However, I was unable to just ignore all of the times he had failed me. I have to give this some thought. The stillness was broken when I eventually spoke. I am unable to respond at this time. He gave a nod. He was still weeping and his eyes were crimson. Please don't take too long. I understand. We're running out of time. I stayed there for what seemed like hours after he departed, mentally reliving everything. It had shook me to see my dad so exposed and vulnerable. I felt as though every barrier I had erected around me was beginning to come down. But I couldn't ignore the past. No matter how much I wanted to assist, I couldn't act as though nothing was wrong. Finding a place for them to stay wasn't the only thing at stake. It had to do with years of suffering and disregard that could not be ignored. I was aware that my choice would have a profound impact on my life. I endured some of the most difficult days ever after my dad's collapse. My thoughts kept returning to that moment whenever I attempted to concentrate on work or anything else. Witnessing him weep, I could hear his voice was desperate. My mind was replaying everything. Even though I knew I would have to make a choice eventually, it was still difficult. I reflected on all the times I had supported them, the sacrifices I had made, giving up my kidney, being expelled, and battling alone while they were preoccupied with my brother. Each recollection was like a kick to the stomach. How could they assume that I would simply forget everything? I was laying in bed one night, and I kept thinking about something my dad had said. There is nowhere else for us to go. I couldn't stop hearing the words. Maybe I was being too harsh, and I felt bad about it. However, another aspect of me brought back memories of the many nights I spent by myself, struggling to stay alive. However, they appeared indifferent. I made the decision to speak with him once again. In person. There was nothing to be gained by avoiding him. I also needed to vent about everything. Thus, I gave him a call and requested that we meet at the same cafe. He sounded relieved as he agreed, as if he believed that this would be the pivotal moment. He was already waiting when I arrived. He seemed worn out. Most likely hadn't slept well since our previous encounter. I took a seat, and we were silent for a while. The air was heavy with the weight of what was going to be spoken. I began, Dad, everything has been on my mind a lot lately. He waited for me to finish by nodding. I responded, I understand why you're asking for my assistance. I know you're in a difficult situation. However, I need you to see my point of view. I could see the worry in his eyes when they met mine. Silently, he murmured, I'm listening. I inhaled deeply. When I needed you the most, you made several decisions that caused me pain. You weren't present. You choose them instead of me, each and every time. I understand, he murmured, his voice almost audible above a whispered, and I apologize for it. I went on. I don't mean to offend you, but you must realize why I find this so difficult. In spite of all that occurred, I've spent years attempting to move on and start a new life. You want me to reintroduce all of that into my life now? I was at a loss for what to do. I've been trying to fix things, but it's not easy, he said. I understand, I answered. However, you must realize that I also find it difficult. It has taken all I had to get to where I am now, and I have gone through hell and back. For a while we sat in quiet, each of us deep in meditation. I quote, "D rather not say no." At last, I said, "But I must tell you the truth. This is not something I can accomplish. I can't allow you to live with her." He appeared to have been struck by a ton of bricks. "Please, Michael." I stopped him by raising my hand before he could continue. "I must defend myself. I spoke aggressively. For far too long. I have prioritized the needs of others over my own, placing their needs ahead of my own. I can't continue like that." "But," he replied, his voice shaking, "we're family. Shouldn't that have any significance?" "Yes, it does," I said. "However, family is more than simply your birth relatives. It all comes down to how you treat one another. I also felt that I wasn't truly a member of this family for far too long. He bowed his head, obviously having trouble understanding what I was saying. "That's not how I intended to make you feel," he muttered. "I understand," I said, "but purpose doesn't negate the effect. I've been bearing the consequences of those decisions for years, and I'm at my breaking point." He wiped his eyes and nodded slowly. He said, "I'm not sure what we're going to do. However, I can see your point of view. I'm hoping you can solve something." I said, "I'm sorry, but I can't be the answer this time." We continued to sit there silently for some time. Not much more could be said. We both had to accept the choice that had been made. He gave me a long, serious look when we eventually stood up to go. "I appreciate your honesty," he remarked. "I wish things were different." "I agree," I answered, and we parted ways after that. I experienced a range of feelings as I left that encounter, including relief, grief, and a persistent sense of guilt. But I felt in my heart that I had made the correct decision. It wasn't simple, but often the most difficult choices are those that are best for you. Story 3. I'm left to try my hand at love. Then she promised her new spouse that she would pay for his children. Okay, so this is how it is set up. My ex-partner Adebo and I split up 8 years ago, just after the birth of our twins. Even our time together had been brief, only 14 months or such, when she discovered she was expecting a child. We both kind of freaked out and decided that perhaps we should attempt to make this work for the children. It quote S like that. Do you believe that a relationship will just develop on its own due to the influence of family? To be honest, we weren't exactly a good fit right away. Sure, we had our share of enjoyable moments, but it wasn't this strong, enduring bond. However, I believed that we might be able to work things out when she became pregnant. However, we were as compatible as chalk and cheese. We did our best, nevertheless, for the twins. It was all right for a time. We did have some disagreements, like everyone does, but nothing significant. We were not at each other's throats, and we co-parented it effectively. After that, she met a new person with whom she hoped to build a future. I understand. She wanted a new beginning, something apart from ours. She was honest about it, and we both felt that it was better to part ways. Since the relationship wasn't very strong, we parted up quite amicably, so I can't say that I was sad. After that, we found our co-parenting rhythm. With 2 adults attempting to raise children from different households, everything went well, or as smoothly as possible. We co-parented fairly well, divided our time fairly evenly, stayed in touch, and paid attention to the children. We both wanted to ensure that there was no stress affecting the twins, so we really tried. We had no child support, and the children had time with both of us. Because we divided everything equally. I then met her now husband around 2 years after our breakup. However, she didn't start dating this guy immediately following our breakup. He was a novel character. The problem is this: our twins and his daughter were the same age. She informed me about him and their growing seriousness. In order to make things simpler for the children, I did wish to support that. When she brought up her stepdaughter, things began to change, even though I was okay with them having another father figure around. We also included our twins and everything else. In a casual way, she said, "Oh, it would be nice if we all did things as one big family." And it appeared innocent enough at first. I assumed she was only attempting to mix families. However, when she began recommending that I treat her stepdaughter as though she were my own, things became a bit weird. Let me clarify now. I have no animosity for her stepdaughter. In the midst of all this, she is still a child. However, Adabo appeared to believe that I had a duty to include her stepdaughter in every activity and trip I took my kids on, simply since we were all related by the twins. When we originally discussed it, I acknowledged that she wanted everyone to be involved, but I informed her that I wasn't supposed to be her new husband's father. Being a good father to my twins had already taken up a lot of my time, but she persisted in promoting the notion. I made an effort to remain calm. It's difficult material. Co-parenting. You're attempting to maintain harmony with an ex and their new partner, while juggling the demands of your family. However, the demands simply continued to mount. When she began expecting me to watch her stepdaughter whenever I had my twins, things took a turn for the worst. She would phone and ask if I would also bring her stepdaughter along, if I was bringing my kids out for a weekend activity. At times, I didn't mind. However, this expectation developed. And don't misunderstand me. I have no problem lending a hand occasionally. However, I didn't agree to be her husband's third parent. To be honest, I didn't think that was fair to either myself or my own children. After a while, I came to the realization that whenever I made plans for my twins, they always ended up talking about the other children in her home. I felt as though I was no longer permitted to spend time alone with my own children. Additionally, I would hear complaints that it wasn't fair if her stepdaughter wasn't treated the same way when I organized a small surprise excursion or bought gifts. I once spent more money on a gift for her stepdaughter than I did for our twins, and she became furious about it. I made the decision to concentrate my time and resources on my twins because I had to draw a line somewhere. She didn't like it when I explained this to her, as was to be expected. She accused me of being self-centered and failing to provide for her entire family. I had not committed to this large mixed family, but that was her desire. I wanted my twins to feel like they belonged, I told her. I didn't have to provide the same level of support for children who weren't mine. It didn't make her happy. However, we managed to keep things amicable enough to carry on co-parenting. If it makes sense, we have been parallel parenting more than co-parenting since that chat. We seldom ever do anything as a large family, and we keep to our individual time with the children. We don't mix the children from her house with mine, nor do we discuss our intentions. It simplifies things and, for me, frees me from these unnecessary demands so I can concentrate on my own children. Nevertheless, she will occasionally bring it up as if I should feel bad for not stepping in to assist, raise all of the children living with her. Her familial situation has only become more difficult over time. After having a child together, she and her spouse eventually adopted her husband's nephew. My twins, their stepsister, a step-cousin, and a half-sister are currently at her house. A demo aims to maintain everyone as a single, contented family. However, I have said unequivocally that my responsibility is with my children. That quote, it. So, yes, it's not easy. Every time I believe we've reached a consensus, something new comes up. However, I've maintained my limits, and I don't believe it's unfair to concentrate on the two children that are truly mine. Supporting her choices as a mother is one thing, but expecting her to be a mom to everyone living with her is quite another. Okay, let's go ahead a little. It was at this point that things truly began to spiral out of control. Setting clear boundaries has become more difficult as a household's size has grown over time. We had initially managed to strike a balance so that I could fulfill my role as a father without being involved in her new family situation, but her demands continued to rise, and it seemed like she needed my assistance with something new every few months. Her husband's nephew, her stepdaughter, their child together. They seemed to keep adding layers, and I was meant to bear part of that burden somehow. And then there was the entire school trip issue. Since my children attend a somewhat smaller school, they are enrolled in a mixed age class. It's fair enough that they are in the same classroom as their stepsister and step-cousin. I understand. Although it's a little odd, I don't mind because it serves the school's needs. However, I didn't anticipate that it would become a major issue with their mother and stepfather on what I was expected to cover. For the children, this journey is really important. This isn't a simple field trip. This interactive museum tour is expected to be fantastic. The school has a workshop set up and intends to let the children learn all this great things through hands-on activities, but it's expensive, without a question. However, my twins were ecstatic, and it seemed like something they would enjoy as a memory. I reasoned that since I could afford it, why not? I already made the payment. In the hopes that she would simply be pleased that the twins were having a positive experience, I tell Adabo about it. False. She became strangely silent the moment I brought up the cost. And then she blatantly stated that it wasn't fair if the other children couldn't attend. I initially believed her to be kidding. She couldn't have really expected me to cover the other two as well. She was dead serious, though. She begins by stating that our children shouldn't be taking this opulent vacation if her other children are unable to attend. I tried to remain composed. I informed her that since I am responsible for my twins, I would be paying for their transportation. If it meant that much, I even suggested that she and her husband try saving money or organizing a fundraiser for the other children. But then she strikes me. You should consider how they will all feel when they watch your children leave for this trip. It seems that if these children don't have the same experiences, the entire household will disintegrate. And this is where things became quite heated. Her husband interrupts, claiming that treating the children differently is unfair. There's a line here, even though I'm all for fairness. I'm not wealthy, and I'm not responsible for his stepsister and nephew. I asked him directly, why am I responsible for paying for all of the children in your home? And he just looks at me like I'm the one who's being self-centered. He even goes on a tirade about how I'm ruining their family and that they should all be siblings. Look, I understand now. No child wants to be excluded, but eventually they must realize that I am not their father. Adebo has a completely different family structure now that she has chosen to include these more children. She can choose to do it. Furthermore, I'm not going to feel pressured to cover the costs of every child she takes in. However, what really irritated me was when they both began to portray me as being unkind. It would be my fault if our twins and their stepsister became estranged over something like this, they said. And it would harm the children's relationships. Come on. This family drama about what I'm not doing for children that aren't even mine has somehow gotten out of hand. I'm just a father trying to do something good for my own children. Look, I don't believe it's reasonable to ask me to pay for everyone's costs, I remarked. For our twins, this journey is a delight. I want them to leave since it's when I'm with them. It not fair to anyone, in my opinion. But Adabo just kept going, saying that if our twins go and the other kids don't, they'll feel like they're being treated as less than, and that I should care about that. Her husband even tried to bring up family unity and said that if the kids end up resenting each other, it'll be on me. At that point, I'm honestly just over it. This isn't about family unity. It's about them attempting to make their financial choices my concern, and it's not like they're struggling to get by either. They have great careers, and if this trip mattered that much, they could find a way to make it work without relying on me. I mean, it's not my duty to stretch my budget, to make up for what they can't or won't do. The whole debate simply kept spinning in circles. They kept saying that I should consider the family and that this is unjust. However, I refused to back down. It wasn't my fault, I told them. They were unable to send the other children, and I refused to allow them to use guilt to get me to pay for it. So we left it there. This was far from finished, though, based on the expression on her face. To be honest, I left the discussion feeling both annoyed and perplexed. No matter how much I tried to explain it, it seemed like I wasn't in charge of all of her family's children. It was just not audible to them. My attention to my own children had somehow become problematic, and I was being portrayed as the bad guy in their family's tale. It's really draining. All I wanted to do was show my twins some love, and now it has grown into this enormous problem of unity and justice. I feel like I have to walk a tightrope because every choice I make might lead to a new dispute. I just wanted to make sure my kids had a good time, but it seems like that's asking for too much. Okay, I thus assumed that, at least for the time being, the dispute over the school trip would be resolved. I believed I had said that I was not covering all of the children's expenses, and I had hoped Adebo and her husband would just stop. They weren't going to let this end without another round, though. But to be honest, this one really took me away, so I wasn't prepared for what occurred next. Adebo sends me a message a few days after the trip fight, stating that she would like to speak with me in person. Although I was aware that this would not be a cordial coffee date, I reasoned that it would be best to stop the conversation now, rather than continue exchanging texts. I accepted, and we decided to meet at this little cafe that's sort of in the middle of our locations. As soon as she arrives, I can tell that this will not be a casual conversation. She wearing that serious expression. The one in which they have practiced their speech, you know. She then takes a seat and begins immediately. I don't believe you comprehend the circumstances. I believe I understand it well, I'm thinking. All I have to do is pay for my children. I did, however, let her speak. She goes into great detail about how I should consider the wider picture, and that this is more than simply a school excursion. The goal is to establish a benchmark for future handling of the situation. I suppose she believes that I would feel compelled to agree if she presents it as this significant family philosophy issue. She begins by explaining that this trip is only one example and that there will be other events, activities, and maybe even family vacations in the future. She also says that we should all agree to treat the children equally. It seemed unbelievable to me. I thought, wait, is she really saying that I should now cover all of her children's family vacations? However, I tried to listen without getting too worked up, since I knew that getting too worked up would just make matters worse. Then she raises the entire issue of fairness once more. If your children get to do these things and the others don't, she says, it will lead to animosity. She says they will feel excluded. She goes so far as to suggest that it could harm the children's relationships with one another and that they will grow up experiencing this inequity, which will cause them to fall apart. As I sit there, it seems to me that they are already distinct children from other homes leading distinct lives. Why must I now address this problem? I attempt to remain composed after she's done and tell her, I understand that you want all the kids to feel equal, but these aren't my kids. I'm not in charge of them. She handles things on her end and I handle things on mine. And I remind her that we've been doing this parallel parenting thing for a long dot. However, it seems that she has decided that is no longer sufficient. The actual kicker is then dropped by her. According to her, you would want to help the entire family, not just your children, if you truly cared about their welfare. She continued by saying that I had to act in good faith by protecting the other children as well. It felt so ridiculous that I nearly burst out laughing. Since when, after all, does taking on everyone else's children in order to support your own? I sensed that I was about to lose it. Look, I do care about the welfare of my children, I informed her. I'm prepared to do these things for them because of this. However, I will not allow you to use guilt to force me to pay for children that are not mine. That didn't sit well with her. She becomes defensive and accuses me of being self-centered and failing to consider the long-term effects on the children. I returned fire. How is only caring for my own children selfish? You decided to bring these more children into your home. I'm not responsible for it. Then her spouse arrives. Yes. I'm not sure whether she intended for him to drop by chance, but all of a sudden he's there and approaching our table. Like he's going to save the day or something. He hardly even recognizes me before turning to Adebo. He takes a seat and begins to attack me as if he's been waiting for this opportunity. I don't think you're being fair, he says. Your behavior is erecting obstacles in the way of our efforts to build a family here. For a while, I simply looked at him, wondering if he truly believed that I would fall for this whole we're all family ploy over my wallet. Thus, I informed him directly. My purpose is to help my twins. I signed up to do that. You can't expect me to act as though I'm financially responsible for all of these other children. Then he strikes me with, well, you're responsible if the children begin to despise one another. It is you who is causing the split that has angered me. You are the one who is trying to get me to act like a father to children who aren't mine, I told him. This isn't something I'm complicating. All I want to do is what's good for my babies. If he felt that I was being chilly, I didn't care. By this time, I thought they were both attempting to turn on me and paint me as the villain because I had boundaries. After then, things became a bit heated. Adabo began to claim that I didn't care enough to support their family ideal, which is why the children would grow up to be bitter with one another. The sound I was hearing was simply unbelievable. If that's the case, perhaps you and your spouse should work out a solution, I informed her. But don't blame me for everything. People in the diner were definitely staring at us by this time. To be honest, I didn't give a damn. I'd had enough of being portrayed as the antagonist in this tale. I only wanted to do something kind for my children, but suddenly it turned into a huge problem regarding my obligations to our family. Since they chose to combine their families, it seemed as though they expected me to heedlessly provide for every child living with them. I remarked, look, I've said my piece, as I eventually got to my feet. My twins continue to be my primary priority. Perhaps you should look at what you guys are doing rather than what I'm doing if you want things to be equal. However, I'm done playing the villain here. After that, I left with a mixture of relief and annoyance. I could see that they would not understand what I was saying. They seemed to be waiting for me to give in and accept their demands, as I could still feel their gaze on me as I walked away. However, I was finished now. I wasn't going to allow them to pressure me into doing anything I hadn't agreed to, because I had established my limits. Wanting your children to feel like they belong to a family is one thing, but expecting someone else to pay for it is quite another. Okay, so I hoped that things would finally calm down after that disastrous chat at the diner. I assumed Adabo and her spouse would understand. Perhaps just let it go and go on. However, I ought to have known better. The entire thing did not simply vanish. In fact, it grew worse. After a few days, I began receiving lengthy texts from her relatives. It began with her sister, who has always avoided becoming involved in our problems, and is generally rather laid back. All of a sudden, though, she is contacting me to discuss how crucial it is that the children feel like they belong to a single large family. She's saying things like, you would be willing to do this for your kids if you truly cared about their happiness. She seemed to be saying that I was doing something wrong just because I refused to cover her sister's stepchildren's expenses. I attempted to ignore it in the hopes that she would simply go on, but they weren't becoming any friendlier, and the texts continued to come in. Subtle insinuations gave way to outright charges. All of a sudden, I'm stingy, self-centered, and lacking in perspective. I swear, they gave the impression that I was splitting up a large, happy family because I didn't want to pay for a vacation for a couple of my children. Her family was behaving as though I had declared war on them, all because I established a limit. Then things worsened. Now Deb's mother chooses to give me a call. I was a little taken aback to see her name appear because I hadn't spoken to her in a long time. I thought she may want to have a quiet conversation about the twins, but that call was something else completely. She got right into her lecture on how things ought to be. This wouldn't be a problem, she assured me, if you just paid for all the children. You should consider how much better it would be if you spent more time with each child. It didn't take long for me to lose my patience. With all due respect, I continued, those children are not my concern. I'm taking care of my own children, and that's what I committed to. A good man takes charge and looks out for the entire family, not just his own, she continued, stating. I was blown away. I made an effort to convince her that, even though I wanted the best for my twins, I didn't have to provide for every child her daughter brought into the family. It seemed as like she wasn't even paying attention when I told her, look, I'm not going to feel bad for taking care of my own kids and setting boundaries. From that, the entire discussion simply took a turn for the worst. She repeated herself, saying that the children will suffer and that it is my responsibility as a parent. Indeed, she made a concerted effort to play the guilt card. I was finished by the conclusion of the call. I gently concluded the talk by telling her that it was obvious that we would not agree on this. However, the pressure persisted. They seemed to be mobilizing the entire family against me over the course of the following week or so. One of my social media postings on being a father even had a comment from a boss brother. He remarked, that was just dripping with passive aggression. True fathers always provide for their families. He was clearly referring to more than simply my children. I didn't answer at all. I just removed the comment and went on. I won't lie, though. It irritated me. I mean, even if I'm trying my hardest for my twins, they still view me negatively. One day, when I was returning to my car after dropping the kids off at a depot, her husband caught up with me. He doesn't greet you, doesn't engage in courteous small conversation. He goes right in and says, you know, this is hurting the kids. To be honest, I was surprised. I assumed we had already worked things out, but it's obvious he wasn't finished. He begins by saying that I should be more mindful of the dynamics of the family, and that my refusal to pay for all the children is causing friction between the siblings. Look, I'm not hurting anyone, I told him. I'm looking after my children. This isn't where they're having trouble. He refused to abandon it, though. He continued to talk about how everyone in the family believes that I'm being unjust, and that the children would eventually realize this and begin to hate one another. I didn't appreciate that he seemed to be attempting to put all the responsibility for the family's happiness on me. Your family's opinion doesn't alter my obligations, I informed him. I'm not their father. I will continue to be present for my children. To be honest, I didn't know what more to say at that time. It seemed like they would always view me as the bad guy in their little family tale, regardless of what I did. I simply sat there that night trying to understand how this had happened. Taking care of my children and providing them with positive experiences was all I desired. And here I was, being portrayed as a heartless individual who didn't value maintaining family harmony. It seems as though they were unable to distinguish between what is and is not fair. In the end, I vented about it to a few close pals. They were amazed at the strain a family was placing on me. One of my friends even made the jest that they could all help pay for the trip themselves if they were so concerned about the kids losing out. Her entire family seemed to have decided that I was required to be this all-in parent to a number of children who weren't mine, which made me giggle but also frustrated. For what purpose? Only to maintain harmony with others who were obviously disregarding my bounds. The entire experience left me with a terrible taste in my mouth. I had had enough of random family members calling and texting me and pushing the same line. They seemed to have developed the notion that I owed them something, and they would not let go until I gave in. By the end of that week, I had come to the conclusion that it was useless to try to reason with them. They had no desire to find an answer. They wanted me to follow their lead. I promised myself that I would not allow them to deplete me. This whole extended family guilt trip wasn't going to change the fact that I am responsible for my children. It, quote, "s absurd to consider that this whole situation began when I was only attempting to cover my child's school expenses, but has since evolved into a dispute over who is providing for the needs of the entire family. I know where I stand, even if they don't like it. I realized I needed to make a definite decision about my limits and stick to them after that week of constant texts, encouraging counsel, and guilt-tripping from family. No exceptions, as I was finished at that time. I knew that no matter how hard I tried to explain myself, they would never understand. This one enormous, joyful family notion had their whole attention. And it turns out that I was the one obstructing their progress by not paying for each additional child they brought into their house. First things first, then. I discussed the impending trip with my twins. After all the commotion, I didn't want them to feel bad or accountable for anything, so I wanted to make sure they were still happy and didn't feel uncomfortable about it. Hey, I'm really looking forward to this trip for you guys, and I want you to know that this is something special for just the two of you, was all I said. I wanted children to know that it was okay for them to enjoy something for themselves. But I didn't go into all the messy details, of course. They both appeared relieved. They sensed some strain, no doubt. They appeared content and really pleased to go on the vacation, but kids often do. That was a tremendous relief to me since I could see they didn't feel horrible about it. I needed children to understand that they were worthy of pleasant experiences, free from guilt about other people. After it was resolved, I realized that I needed to be specific rather than ambiguous in my boundaries with Adobo and her family. I'm simply paying for a sort of border for my kids, but there should be a clear line that they know they can't cross. I called her as a result. I didn't want this to escalate into another debate that lasted an hour, so I kept it simple and calm. In essence, I told them that my job as a father is to provide for my kids. I'm doing everything I can to provide them with positive experiences because I'm here for them. However, that does not apply to children who are not mine. My twins are the end of my financial responsibilities, but I appreciate your decisions, and your family. Adebo was obviously not thrilled. She started talking about the other children's feelings right away, and how it's unfair for siblings to have different experiences. I allowed her to speak, but I interrupted her when she began to revert to her guilt-tripping behavior. I know how you feel, but this is my final decision, I informed her. Other than our twins, I won't be covering any further costs. I told her to quit putting pressure on me, and that it was up to her if she wanted to figure anything out for her home. I could tell she was furious since there was a little period of stillness, but I wasn't going to back down. She must have understood it wasn't going anywhere, but I could almost feel her getting ready to try one final throw, ultimately, comma. She said something along the lines of, well, I suppose you've made your decision. With the intention of making me feel awful, but I didn't. To be honest, I was more relieved than anything else at that time. I had finished introducing myself. It was quieter after that. No more sporadic communications from her relatives. No more passive-aggressive remarks. Nothing but quiet. Indeed, it was lovely to have some serenity at last, even though it was a little odd. They just had to cope with the fact that I wasn't going to give in to their pressure, I believe, in the weeks before the journey. To keep things feeling normal, I made sure to spend some additional time with the twins performing everyday activities. We would eat, visit a park, watch movies, and do other routine activities. Instead of getting sucked into whatever problems the adults around them were facing, I wanted them to feel safe and content. And to be honest, it was nice to concentrate just on them without any additional turmoil. The excursion day eventually arrived. They were all beaming and eager to go when I left them off at school that morning. After everything that had transpired, it was wonderful to see them so thrilled. I had a genuine sense of joy as they hurried off to join their pals, thinking, yeah, this is everything. Making everyone happy or going above and above for those who don't value it isn't the goal. It's about doing my best to raise my children and showing them that setting limits is okay. Here, quote, the worst part though. Please be patient with me. I know I said I wouldn't use that term. I received a call from her the day following the trip. She just inquired whether the children had fun, which was more than the sarcastic remark or passive-aggressive jab I was anticipating. I informed her that they did, but I didn't want to start a new debate, so I kept it brief. But then I was taken aback by her. In fact, she commended me for doing what I thought was right. I admire that you defended yourself and your children, even if I didn't agree with you, she remarked. Perhaps it was what I needed to hear. To be honest, I was taken aback. She came around even though I didn't anticipate it. It seemed like a little admission that perhaps I wasn't the bad guy, but it wasn't an apology. I had been portrayed by them all. Things have been much more tranquil since then. Her family doesn't communicate with me, and it seems like we've come to a new agreement. Although we may not always agree, we have both come to terms with our responsibilities in the children's life. In all honesty, I believe it has improved me as a father since I no longer question every choice I make and consider how it would impact her family. All I'm thinking about is what's best for my babies. Ultimately, this entire experience taught me a valuable lesson. Saying no to other people isn't always the only way to establish boundaries. It's about accepting your own mental well-being. I've discovered that I don't have to feel bad about putting my own family first. And it's not my fault if others don't understand. Yes, things are going well right now. The twins are content. I'm content. Furthermore, it seems as though we are finally letting go of all the unnecessary burdens. I've stated my position clearly, and I believe that everyone has learned to appreciate it, even Adebo and her spouse. There will undoubtedly be hiccups along the way, and it's not flawless. However, at least I now know that I can maintain my integrity and make choices that are best for my family without becoming sidetracked by what other people think. Postscript. I thought I might have heard the last of the requests a few weeks after things had finally calmed down. Adobo then surprises me with something fresh. She begins by discussing the twins' living arrangements at her house and how they lack the same conveniences that they do with me. I initially assume she's simply ranting, but then she begins to imply that I ought to take action. She wants me to purchase a home, it turns out. For them, not for me. She's arguing that it's unfair for the children to go between two very different lifestyles and that it can damage their self-esteem if they feel inadequate in her house. She quote, "dead serious," yet I'm sitting there trying to figure out whether she's serious. In fact, she expects me to purchase a second home so she may reside there as well as provide accommodations for the children while they are with her. All on my dime. Even though I make an effort to remain composed, I can't help but wonder how it makes sense. You've got a house already. She talks endlessly about how their home is too small for a family, how it affects the child's mental health and her own size. She is discussing equal standards as if I should compensate her for every decision she has made after our breakup, when I inform her that won't occur. She indulges in every possible guilt trip. "Don't you want the kids to feel as at ease at my place as they do with you?" she asks. And how unjust it is that I refuse to give them the opportunity to live their lives to the fullest. I don't want to purchase her family a new home, so she's behaving like I'm some heartless jerk. Right now, I'm finished. "Look, the twins have all they need at your house. I tell her, you and your spouse can deal with them if you believe they require a larger home. I'm not in charge of remodeling your house." She is silent for a moment. "Well, if the kids end up feeling like they have a real home only with you, that'll be on you," she retorts. The talk ends when I just shake my head. How she believed this to be a legitimate request is beyond me. I don't have to purchase her a completely new way of life just because I want the best for my children. She may probably ask for anything she wants, but at least I now understand. I've drawn the line and won't back down.